Greetings, my friends. You must be interested in horror movies because that is where you and I are going to be spending the next 15 plus minutes of our lives. And remember this, my friends, past and present events such as these did happen. You must be interested in the historical, the horrific, and the spooky. My friends, we are all here to tell you the events, the people, the movies, the dates. My friends, this is horror movies and the real world.
In this documentary, we'll be discussing how the real world affects horror movies through time, and sometimes how horror movies affect the real world. We start off with the 1900s and 1910s, but what is that? There's nothing there. Well, that's a mixture of World War I and art snobs. Let me explain. When film was being first introduced, they mainly thought it would be a fad, like fidget spinners or loom pads, something that would last for a bit, but not long. Even though now we know that's not true, back then that's what they thought. So due to that, they didn't preserve film that well, and film is very easily flammable. So when the studio caught on fire, all the films would go on fire and everything would be lost. And during World War II that was even worse, because since it was a war, places would get blown up, film would be on fire, and they even used films to make bombs. But it's not just exclusive to the 1910s and 1900s. In the 1920s, Nosferatu, which is a very famous horror film now, was almost lost because the widow of Bram Stoker, aka the guy that wrote Dracula, ordered to have every film burnt for plagiarism against her dead husband's work. And she was actually successful in that, but one copy was found in a vault in 1970s, and the film was reproduced and is now one of the horror classics. And there's also in the 1930s the first ever sound Universal horror film, The Cat Creeps, which is mostly lost except for a few clips that were used in a Halloween comedy special called Boo. Things get a lot more interesting though in the 20s. Since World War I has ended and the Germans lost, they were quite frustrated, as you imagine, and they dealt with that through art, through poetry, paintings, and yes, even film.
With movies like Nosferatu, The Golem, and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. But over in America, it was the start of the Universal monsters with The Man Who Laughs, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and The Phantom of the Opera. Which the latter two starred a man of 1,000 faces, Lon Chaney, who was the master of the silent film genre. With both his parents being deaf, he mastered the art of expressing himself without words, but sadly, and kind of ironically, he died of throat cancer in 1930, the beginning of sound cinema, which is a very tragic way to show a beginning of a new era of horror.
From 1929 till 1939, it was the Great Depression, which was basically a period in American history where the economy crashed and everyone was broke. Your mum was broke. Your dad was broke. The homeless man on the corner was considered financially stable.
To everyone being broke, movies weren't making that much money as they used to, since people couldn't go to the cinemas much since they didn't have money. And studios were shutting down left and right, and Universal thought they would meet the same fate. But then they had a massive double whammy in 1931 with both Dracula and
I am Dracula.
And Frankenstein.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! Oh, in the name of God! Now I know what it feels like to be God!
which made loads of money for the studio. Since at the time people just wanted something to take their minds off what was going on in the real world, and there's nothing better than a monster movie.
Listen to them. Children of the night. What music they make.
So after that, Universal made more monster movies based on literary work, with The Invisible Man, The Raven, and The Black Cat.
You killed her. You killed her as I am about to kill you.
And even sequels to them like The Bride of Frankenstein and Dracula's Daughter, which were unheard of at the time. Other companies tried the same thing, with Paramount making Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and RKO making King Kong, which were both big hits.
Boys, I'll share it with all of you. Why, in a few months it'll be up in lights on Broadway. Kong, the eighth wonder of the world!
But there was a brief part in the mid-1930s where they stopped making monster movies, since the Universal didn't think they were profitable anymore with the failure of Dracula's Daughter. But they did a limited time re-release of Dracula, Frankenstein of Sun and Kong in the August of 1938, which brought the Universals back. A year later, in 1939, they made Son of Frankenstein, which was a smash hit and brought the Universal monsters back for more sequels and original movies.
Do you think with the 30s over, films would get more experimental since people would go to the cinema more, which means films would have higher budgets? Wrong. In 1939, a little Austrian man from Germany called Adolf Hitler tried to take over the world, which started World War II. And how did Hollywood deal with this?
Of course, mainly war films, but comedy films at the time would take satire of the war, with films like Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator.
They will love you, they will adore you, they will worship you as a god.
No, you mustn't say it. You make me afraid of myself.
And cartoons were used as propaganda or to convince other countries to join the war.
Any stamps, any bonds today.
But it didn't really affect horror movies that much, since it was just the same old stuff we were getting in the 1930s with just more monster movies like The Wolfman and Phantom of the Opera. It was the same reason as in the 1930s, they needed escapism from the real world, and many people weren't going to the cinema for obvious reasons, but studios needed to use a formula which they knew already worked. So it was just more monster movies. But at the end of the decade, these movies were more used for comedy than horror, with the Abbott and Costello Meet series. And even these days, the Universal monsters aren't treated as seriously as they once were. And even though they had their moments, in the modern era, they're still mostly used for silly fun. So with the Universal monsters not being popular anymore, what was next for horror?
At the end of the 40s, another war started in the 50s between the US and the Soviet Union, trying to decide which is better, communism or capitalism. But they never actually fought, thus why it was called the Cold War. But at the time, no one knew that. So as you can imagine, people living in America would be terrified of either the Soviets invading or bombing them with a nuclear bomb.
The horror movies of the 1950s represented that fear perfectly, with it tackling the subject head on, with the movies being about nuclear disasters, which was mainly about animals growing big from a nuclear bomb. Or with The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, where a group of scientists testing nuclear bombs, but by doing that awaken a prehistoric monster that goes on a rampage. There's also the most famous example, Godzilla, which is an easy allegory about the destructive power of nukes, since it's a monster created by nuclear energy destroying everything in its path. And this was definitely intentional, with the director of the film stating it was to destroy the destructive power of nuclear bombs after the Hiroshima bombing and to show the rest of the world their destructive power. The other horror movies in America were about aliens and invasions, like War of the Worlds.
Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Or The Thing from Another World. Since alongside the fear of nuclear bombs, they were also terrified of the Soviets invading with possibly unknown technology like the ones you see in the alien movies.
I bring you a warning. Every one of you listening to my voice, tell the world. Tell this to everybody wherever they are. Watch the skies, everywhere. Keep looking. Keep watching the skies.
Hammer Studios is a studio that in the UK were famous for making low-budget films that were mostly detective films. But in the late 50s they tried their hand in horror movies, which was a massive success, and after that they went back to the roots with The Curse of Frankenstein and Dracula, starring Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, who are most famous for their roles in Star Wars.
I've become more powerful than any Jedi. Even you.
Which were not like the Universal monster films before, because these were violent, bloody, gratuitous, which was unseen at the time and paved the way for many horror films of the future.